leave. Okay, so anytime you're
All right, so now we get to go to part 3 of this episode, talking about Armored Saints March of the Saint. And we get to, for the first time on this podcast, actually get to speak to a musician that was on the track. We welcome my good friend, Mr. John Bush, the singer of Armored Saint.
What's up, Brian? Hi,
How are you,
Christian.
man? So, March of the Saint, I picked this song because I feel it's one of those early 80s songs that really does come to the title of the show, which is the defines heavy metal. And this was a, 1982 song that came out in 1983, obviously. But for me, it was one of the first West Coast, California, USA songs that was really influenced by what was happening in Europe with the European heavy metal stuff. This is, Metallica was doing their thing, obviously, but you guys were more doing the traditional metal. And this song, I remember when I first heard it, when I first saw you guys live, I was like, whoa, this is like this amazing song that, Priest or Maiden or one of those bands that we all loved at the time could have made. So where did the whole idea for this song come from?
Well, the riff was, I believe, Dave Pritchard's. I mean, it was just a classic, and he just, you think he just banged that out one day, and then I don't know how the beat came into play, but it just sounded like it should be a pretty fast song and upbeat. What I used to do back in the day, a lot of the time, we'd get in the studio and we would just come up with riffs and stuff, and then I would just kind of mumble over those parts and just try to come up with some kind of vocal melodies. That was my approach in 1983 or so. And, record it and say, oh, that sounds pretty good. And that mumbling sounds pretty good. I don't remember exactly, to be honest, how like the verse came up and then we went into the B section. But the chorus obviously felt like it had to be a big anthem. And it all felt like it should be the first song of the set. And it sounded like, the way to kind of accumulate a fan base by having them all become part of the March of the Saints. So, it was probably a pretty easy song to write based on the theory that it took shape from the riff to the upbeatness of the song to the this really cool B section, and then which was melodic, and then the chorus was just one that was an anthem to have me sing, and then the answerers and repeating me, and it was simple.
And in those early days too, another really important aspect of the song was the show part of it. Again, we're talking like early 80s. There's not a lot of production happening. And, we didn't really see a lot of shows with a lot of production. But you guys kind of made that the beginning, especially, I'll never forget the famous Perkins Palace show where you come out dressed as a knight and there's a whole battle with you and another guy. And then you take off the helmet and it's you and you go right into March of the Saints. It's like one of my favorite memories of any live show I've ever seen. It was so great.
Well, it was amazing. That was not just any guy who took the helmet off. That was the famous Zach Harmon, who was our tour manager and drum tech for years until Metallica said, we're going to take him. And they did. And he's been with them ever since, which is
still
really
there.
Cool. Still there, which is really cool. Zach and his brother Derek went to high school with Dave in South Pass. So that's how we got to know him. And he was awesome. We called him the He-Man because he looked like it and he was all buff and he really looked like the He-Man character. And he took the helmet off. And then my good friend, Andy Waterlawn, who ironically enough, I just kind of acknowledged his 20-year anniversary of his passing, actually, which was like a week ago. And he was a very good friend of ours at the time. And he was the Black Knight in that fight. And there's a couple of funny tidbits about that fight. One was we recorded all that part. This is pretty kind of primitive as far as the production of it, but we recorded everything and then we practiced the choreography with the fighting with real swords, but obviously not intending to hit one another too hard. But the adrenaline kicked in so hard that I was actually hitting it. His sword, and I was way off time. I was just too amped, so it was like the swords would hit, and it would be like, then, so they were totally on time. And then at one point, I hit him like in the face, and it dented the helmet of his armored suit. and then he
Lucky didn't knock him
fell.
out.
I mean, it was probably way too aggressive, but what can you say? And then he ended up, being dragged off, going down the steps in the suit of armor at Perkins Palace and falling and not being able to get up out of his suit because he's in a suit of armor and everybody's on stage, crew, band, whatever. So eventually somebody must have went down there for something and we're like, what the hell? And then they picked him up. And so it was pretty funny actually. But it was a classic show, and we only did it the one time. Obviously, it would have been something that would have been amazing to do on a regular basis, but we just couldn't afford it, quite frankly.
Yeah, that's why it was so amazing at the time. Which is like, whoa, I didn't expect that. I mean, it was a big show at Perkins Palace, and there's a lot of people there and everything. But that was pretty spectacular. So, when you guys are writing, and obviously you guys were really young kids at this time, any did you feel like when you're writing this song that like, wow, this is going to be this really great anthem that people are going to listen to for years and look back on as being a real historical side, or you're just doing it because you're kids and you love the music?
I think that we kind of knew we hit onto something pretty strong with that song. We had "Can You Deliver" that eventually became the first video of the record, and it was kind of weird because the way that the guy who directed that video, he came up with this idea of putting the intro march into the song, and then it went into "Can You Deliver," which was actually very cool and kind of inventive, but a little weird because it was two songs that he kind of merged into one, the intro of March into Can You. But Can You was the song that became the one and only single, if you will, well, video of that record. But March always was like, it was the title track. It was the song that, started the show for years. As a matter of fact, you and I just discussed this recently, as you told me that we need to put it back as the opening track. So of the live show, that is, because we've been opening with End of the Attention Span because it's a new record, but recent record. But in any case, I think we knew we kind of hit onto something that felt very just special to our band. And it has carried on without a doubt.
Yeah, how does that make you feel? Because people come up to me all the time and talk about, how amazing that first record was and how like this song was really like one of the first heavy songs that a lot of people got into. So now when people come up to you and say like, man, that was a really pivotal moment and this is such a great song. Like, what do you feel when people come and say that to you?
I'm honored. I love that record. It's always going to be the first one that, the first full length record, because we did make the EP before that, of course, but it was the first full length record. And, there's a lot. I could go on and talk about it, but there's hits and misses with that record, in my opinion. So one of the misses is it wasn't quite as raw as we were a band live. We were like this kind of glorified, and I say we still are, this kind of glorified garage band. And when you saw us live, it was raw, and the record was overly polished because that was the circumstances back in the day. We were in the 80s. Everybody had big budgeted records. And production was just gigantic. And, Michael James Jackson, who produced that record, probably wanted to make something that was in line with everything else that was coming out at that time. So it probably was a little bit overly polished for what we sounded like live. Maybe that worked to our benefit when we performed, because everyone's like, wow, this band is so heavy. But that's one thing. But overall, like, it was, the cover is amazing. It's kind of one of those things that even if the record was terrible, people would look at that cover and go, I'm buying that album, because it was that beautiful. And Dave actually went to England to take part in the actual art production of that cover, which was really cool. So we always hear the funny story of him going, because he'd never been to England. None of us had been overseas. And he went in and he met Peter Manch, who was our manager at the time. And Peter, he went to go and get in Peter's car. And of course, he went into the driver's side. And Peter kept going, you're in England. You're in England. Passenger, you're over there. You're over there. So that's a pretty funny story associated with it. But yeah, it was really cool. It came out, incredible. And, the song is, hopefully it'll live on past our lives. And I think it will.
Oh, I'm sure it will. Well, the one thing, and we talked about it with Jay earlier, the the production end of things. And that's always kind of been for me, and I know a bit for you guys too, kind of the one letdown with that record. And you talk about it very well. But I remember when we were talking about who was going to produce the record, and Michael James Jackson's name came up, and I thought, like, oh, cool, he did War Machine by Kiss, which is
Right.
super heavy. And
Oh,
then I remember, being in the studio and hearing the rough tracks, and it was all raw and super heavy. I'm like, oh, this is going to be amazing. And then I got the final mix. I was like, ooh, this is kind of not there.
yeah.
And it was weird because, again, like I went back and listened to War Machine. It's so heavy. I found out years later that the reason why War Machine was so heavy is because actually Paul Stanley, Gene Simmons in the studio wanted it to be really heavy, and they kind of took over control a little bit of that, and as opposed to Michael James Jackson doing it, who wasn't really the biggest metal guy out there. So that's probably a little bit. It's always been my complaint about that first record. I think if the mix was better, it might have, things might have been a little bit different. But you can't go back in time and redo these things, right?
Right. I mean, it was funny because Joey always tells the story about Michael James, and Michael James was such nothing but a great guy, a super guy, and he's passed on, so we don't want to talk poorly of him. But
No, he was a very nice guy. Yes.
really, really nice guy. I think he was going through a divorce at the time, so that probably kind of distracted him. But he did say this one comment one time that Joey always points out in interviews, saying that Michael said, "I didn't like Black Sabbath," and right there, we should have probably fired him. Right when we heard that, it's like, you're fired. But I think he was just doing what he thought was right for us. It just it just didn't really kind of represent how we really sounded as a band live. And I think that was the issue that we struggled with sometimes with the record. But the songs are great. Most of them, I think. And it was a great beginning point for us to kind of say, okay, we're here. And we went out and toured to a Quiet Riot in Whitesnake. And that was, we did that record, and then we went out and opened for Quiet Riot in Whitesnake for about, 20, 25 shows. We were playing Market Square Arena in Indianapolis and Cobo Hall. And, we're like, what are we doing here? Like, we're literally all just turned 21 and playing arenas. I mean, it was like weird. And, it was pretty awesome.
So back in those early days, obviously, especially, we all grew up in LA, the LA area, and there was not a lot of metal happening there until the scene started happening. So for you guys as kids, like, where did you first hear metal, and what were the bands that really influenced you?
Well, I think that we were always, actually, I was kind of pay ode to an old neighbor of mine. His name was David Avila. He was actually the one guy who actually went out and found all these bands. He had a really kind of adventurous state of mind of music. He was my next door neighbor. We had the first musical thing we ever did. Me and Joey were in a thing with him called Rhapsody, which, of course, because he was a Queen fan, a huge Queen fan. We played a town show. It was great. It was awesome. We probably sounded terrible, but it was a lot of fun. It was kind of our first performances. But David was awesome. He was the first guy to say, I got this record. His band is called Thin Lizzy. Check it out. Oh, I got this record. It's really cool. They're called Angel. We'd be like, wow, and look and go, that sounds amazing. So I don't know really where his sources was, but he was one of the guys who really kind of discovered a lot of bands. And then we all kind of, got into them collectively. And he was really the guy who kind of got it started for us. He wasn't the greatest guitar player. He played this kind of 335, and it played it through like a PV, and it just sounded terrible. But he was very creative and adventurous as somebody discovering music. And that's why eventually we didn't really play with him anymore, but we still remained friends for years. And then he kind of got this weird sickness and passed on. But that was the starting point for discovering all these bands. And that was like late 70s. We're talking junior high schools when we really kind of discovered all those bands. Then it went into the early 80s, like everybody, when, new wave of British heavy metal kicked in, and, Leopard and Maiden, Motorhead, and all the Saxon, all everybody else followed. And then everybody, all the metal people at that time who were really into metal got into those bands. And then it, morphed into something way more powerful and crazy. And then the Metallicas and Armored Saints and the Anthraxes and Slayers and everybody followed suit with their own thing, and it changed even more. So we were always so stoked to be part of any scene. And LA at that time was raging, as we all know. It was 83, 84. It was on the heels of Quiet Riot and Motley Crue really kind of starting it all. And then the Rats, the Steelers, the Great Whites, the Armored Saints, the Black and Blues, a lot of, these bands kind of followed suit. Their little kind of odd part about it is that even though we had nice hair, some of us still do, God's own do, we really weren't part of the sound of LA. So that was kind of like one of our kind of quagmires, if you will, because we really were way more into the British bands that were happening. And so that kind of influenced our sound more so. We loved Rat and Steeler and Great White and all these bands, and we played with them, and we had great shows. Wasp, we were playing again still with Wasp. We had all these great shows with these bands, but we did sound a little bit different. And again, quagmire again was we were actually too heavy for a lot of the LA bands, but the ironic thing is we weren't heavy enough to really be part of the thrash movement that happened. So you had, Testament, Death Angel, Anthrax, Metallica, Overkill, Slayer, of course. And so we didn't really fit into either one of those groups. Played with all those groups, a lot of them, but we never really fit in. So I always said Armored Saint kind of went through a slight inferiority complex because we weren't really taking place and taking part with these trends, and they were trendy things that were happening at the time. And so we kind of bounced around, and it did lead to a little bit of like, what do we do? How do we dress now? We don't want to wear this armor anymore. Metallica's wearing t-shirts, and this stuff's cold and it's wet leather that we're putting on in Buffalo in January, and this is terrible, but it's kind of our image. And so we did have a little bit of issues with image and
and to that point, in the early 80s in LA, there was a metal scene going on there. It was very underground and very condensed.
Sure.
And we would have these parties. It was Bitch, Omen, Metallica,
Savage
Grace. Savage Grace, yeah, all of them. And you guys were especially tight with the Metallica camp while Metallica was in LA. Now, of course, the famous story is that they wanted you to sing for them and all that crazy early stuff. But you guys were incredibly close with them while they were in Los Angeles. How did that all happen?
Well, that happened. First they saw us play. I think it was the Woodstock in Anaheim, and they saw us perform, and that was the idea that they said, well, this guy's a good singer. He would be a great addition to our band. And John Cornarians actually always, I think he still has this, he always talks about, he has a set list from a Metallica show from the Woodstock where it has the guest list, and it says new singer John Bush, that I was supposed to be on the guest list. I don't know if I went to that show, but it's pretty funny. He still has that paper he showed me recently, which is hilarious. But, it didn't pan out for me to actually become the singer of the band for various reasons, mainly because it was James's position to hold, and of course forever it should be, because I could never imagine another guy fronting Metallica, including me. But and I can never imagine James Hetfield not being the lead vocalist in a heavy metal band.
It all happened the way it should be. But also at the time, you guys were actually farther along and more popular than Metallica was when that was happening in the early 80s.
Well, because we were part of the LA scene that was blowing up a little bit, and then they said we're out of here because we don't fit in here, and that's when they took up to the Bay Area, and obviously this started happening there. But there was, there's always that Northern Southern California rivalry that still exists in sports and everything else. But and so like there was that, and again there was Jet Boy. You had bands that were kind of that weren't totally into the thrash scene, but the thrash scene definitely was way more prominent, of course, there.
Yes.
In LA was definitely, even though you had these other bands that were on Metal Blade, like you mentioned, Bitch and Omen, they were a little more underground than some of the bands like Rat and Great White, where those bands were kind of just, quite frankly, bigger and probably a little more commercialized. So, that probably even led to our thing. It wasn't really till, years later when we got dropped from Chrysalis after making 3 records and starting to write songs that eventually became Symbol of Salvation, that I think we really kind of found our niche. And that was where we just kind of said, we don't care. We're just going to like do whatever comes natural to us. And that's when I think the songwriting took a little step up. And that was
Yep.
a simple record.
I would agree wholeheartedly with that. So the guy you mentioned earlier, your neighbor Dave, was he the guy that introduced you to Piazza, Mike Piazza?
Oh, no. Dave was way more earlier, but that was I was also a neighbor. His name was
You
Randy.
got to tell the story because it's amazing.
So I had moved back to my mom's house. I was on tour a lot, and so my mom we were selling the house that we grew up in, and she couldn't live there anymore because she really just couldn't take care of herself anymore. So the house went up for sale, and I was on the road a lot, but I was paying for this apartment in Redondo Beach, and I was like, "What am I doing this for? I'm just going to go back to my parents' house and live there till it sells." Well, my dad had died since then, but I'm like, I'll just go live there rent free because I'm gone a lot. So I was out there one day, and then this kid walks up. Well, he was like 20 years old at the time, probably. And it was my neighbor, Randy Batanz, who was actually the little brother of a guy named Larry Batanz, who in my circle of friends is an infamous person because, well, I can't go on a tangent because he's just one of a kind, but he was a very unique individual, got into a lot of mischief, and we kind of watched Larry turn into this crazy, funny, hilarious guy through the years. And he was our age. Randy was his younger brother. Anyway, Randy had a Dodgers jersey, and I started talking to him. I go, "Hey, what's with the Dodgers jersey? It's cool." And he goes, "Oh, I'm a bat boy." And I go, "Bat boy?" And he goes, "Yeah, I'm bat boy for the Dodgers." I go, "Wow, that's rad." And then I'd heard that Mike Piazza was a pretty big metalhead. I go, and he was obviously with the Dodgers organization then. And I said, "Well, I hear Mike Piazza's a huge metalhead." He goes, "Yeah, I heard that." And I go, "Well, tell him," I was in Anthrax at that time. I go, "Well, tell him the singer of Anthrax says what's up." And he goes, "Okay." And then 2 days later, he knock on the door. I open the door. It's Randy. He goes, "He wants to meet you." And I was like, "What?" And he goes, "He wants to meet you." He goes, "He told me, here's his number. He wants you to call him, and he wants you to come to a game." And I was like, "Wow, all right." The funny part of the story, I think I might have been telling you that night at the party, but I'll say it for the podcast, was that we did go to a game. It was me and several friends and my older brother, Tony, and we went and we had these rad seats, and we met Mike outside the locker room before the game. And then, Mike saying, "Hey, all right, what's cool? I'm a huge fan, blah, blah, blah. Hey, did you guys get some good seats? And we hook you up?" I was going, "Yeah, right behind home plate. It's amazing. Thank you so much." He's like, "All right, great." And so my brother, probably being uncomfortable in the environment with this superstar player, says, "Yeah, so don't make an error." And we all just kind of looked at him like, "What?" Not like, "Hey, so hit a homer or something, but don't make an error." I mean, it's just trying to be funny. But second inning, guy's still in first, throws it into center field, makes an error.
Oh no!
And
Jinxed it.
after that, I think the next like 8, 9 games that Piazza got me tickets to, they lost. And he was like, "Dude, I think you're bad luck." And I go, "It's my brother. He cursed it." Pretty funny.
That was amazing. Yeah, I remember you called me up one time and asked, you had hung out with him a few times. Said, "Dude, he wants to meet you." I'm like, "Same thing." Like, what? So called him up. He said, "Yeah, let's go meet." We met at some show. I forget. It was like some small show, and basically just talked for like an hour and a half about metal, and became good friends with him until he went to New York. Still good friends with him, but not as much as when he was in LA. But yeah, it's just so bizarre because he was like one of the, obviously the Hall of Fame now, one of the most famous people in LA at the time, playing for the Dodgers, this huge, star. And I'd always go hang out with him at these shows. They're just so crazy. It's like, I'm hanging out with Mike Piazza, and he's a normal guy, a huge metalhead.
Totally. At that time, he actually lived with Eric Carroll. So they were both stars on the Dodgers that lived together. I went to their house. Like, we hung out in Manhattan Beach at some bars. We did a lot. I actually went to the Super Bowl with him. And his agent at the time, Danny Lozano. It was in Miami, and it was the Chargers and the Niners, that Super Bowl. I don't remember which one, but yeah, he had like a suite. Cool. And it was amazing. We had some good times.
Yeah,
he came to the MTV Awards with us when Anthrax was nominated for Black Lodge it must have been 94 MTV Awards, and he came with us in a limo with the whole band and everything.
Yep. Yeah, he's a good dude. And Karos was great too. I remember asking Karos though at one point, like, "Are you into the metal as much as Piazza is?" And he goes, he liked Metallica and Anthrax, but he didn't go as far. Like Piazza was into everything. He's into even Cannibal Corpse and like the death metal stuff. Like, holy cow.
Yeah, he knows his metal. He really does. And now him and Trunk are really good friends. And it's great.
He moved to New York, and Trunk became his best buddy. So All good though. Well, dude, I can't thank you enough for this. It's been super fun and great to talk about the history of Armored Saint and the history of this amazing song, The March of the Saint.
Well, it's been re-released on Metal Blade Records, and as we go out and open for Wasp on this upcoming tour, we're going to bring a lot of copies, and hopefully we sign them and we'll sell them all. So that's great. So you're a huge part of it as well, as you always have been.
Awesome. I appreciate that, man. Thanks for doing this again. Appreciate you.
Awesome.
All right, cool. Done.
Rad.
Okay, hang on.
25
Let
minutes.
me. I gotta end the record.